Well, welcome again, everyone. It's great to have you with us on this Sabbath day. You know, angels are one topic in the Bible that seem to be rarely discussed. And I'd originally planned to talk about angels in a single sermon. What, excuse me? Okay, sorry. Okay. I'd originally planned to talk about angels in a single sermon a couple of weeks ago, but it didn't work out that way. So today we'll be looking at angels, part 3. We've received feedback from our previous discussions about angels, and many of you have asked some questions about the angels. You know, despite the numerous times angels are mentioned in our Bibles, there's not as much specific information about the heavenly angels as we might expect. Well, let's see if we can answer some of these questions today. So for our first question, do humans become angels? Well, remember, God created different kinds. Even the angels in heaven appear to be of different kinds. Last week we talked about the cherubim and the seraphim. They both are heavenly angels, but are actually different kinds of angels. If you would, let's turn over to Psalms chapter 8, and that's verse 4. That's Psalms chapter 8, verse 4. Now today, of course, man is not equal to the angels. In fact, we can't even really compare our strength and power to that of the heavenly angels right now. For sheer power in a single being, we previously saw that one angel from heaven destroyed 185,000 men in just one night. Now, that's obviously much more power than humans wield today. But again, if you would, Psalms 8, verse 4, let's see what David has to say about this. He says, "What is man, that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man, that you visit him? For you have made him a little lower than the angels, and have crowned him with glory and honor." Well, verse 5 tells us that we were created lower than the angels in heaven. Now, as far as we can tell, the angels in heaven will remain in their current state as time passes. They don't seem to change. But we humans will not remain in our current state forever. Physical humans all have a temporary existence. In fact, Hebrews 9, verse 27 tells us, "And it's appointed unto men once to die, but after this, the judgment." All humans will eventually be judged. Christ will separate the lambs from the goats. The lambs at his right hand, and he'll place the goats on his left. The goats will end up in the lake of fire. But what happens to the sheep? Well, Matthew 25, verse 34 tells us, "Then shall the king say unto them on his right hand," the sheep, "Come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world." Those entering into God's kingdom will ultimately become spirit beings. Now, at that point, they will actually become higher than the angels in heaven and wield even greater power than they do. For example, 1 Corinthians 6, verse 2 gives us an idea of this power, greater than the angels in heaven. I'll just read it to you. The saints being spoken of here, of course, the future saints in God's kingdom. 1 Corinthians 6, verse 2 says, "Do you not know that the saints shall judge the world? And if the world shall be judged by you, are you unworthy to judge the smallest matters? Know you not that we shall judge the angels?" If you would go ahead and turn over to Hebrews chapter 2. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 5. So humans will become spirit beings like the angels, but not the same type of spirit being. Just as Jesus Christ and the Father, you could say, are spirit beings, but they're not exactly like the created angels of heaven. Both are spirit beings, but they're not quite equal. Again, Hebrews 2, verse 5, I'd like to read this to you in the International Standard Version. Here's what it says. For he did not put the coming world we are talking about, that's God's kingdom, under the control of the angels. So you see that the angels will not have any authority in God's kingdom. Instead, someone has declared somewhere, "What is man, that you should remember him, or the Son of Man, that you should care for him?" Well, I think that someone was David we just saw in Psalms 8, verse 4, right? Okay, that's who it is. He didn't say. Verse 7. "You made him a little lower than the angels, yet you crowned him with glory and honor, and put everything under his feet." Now, when God put everything under him, he left nothing outside his control. The Contemporary English Version reads, "And you have put everything under our power, God has put everything under our power and has not left anything out of our power. But we don't see it all under our power. Humans were created to one day rule and judge in God's great kingdom, and nothing is left out of our power. That's awesome. It's difficult to comprehend, but we don't have that kind of power just yet. Today, man is lower than the Father in Jesus Christ, of course, and he is also lower than the angels. But one day, man will judge the angels. In God's kingdom, we will be higher than the angels. But at no time are we ever equal to the angels, or do we ever become angels. So to answer the question, humans don't become angels. In the future, we will become spirit beings, but at that point, we will be even higher than the angels. Humans were created to one day supersede the angels in heaven, to become greater than the angels are today or ever will be. Next question we have here. Should we worship or pray to angels? Now, Jesus taught us to pray to the Father. You might recall he says in Matthew 6, verse 9, "After this manner, therefore, pray you, Our Father which art in heaven." And of course, we might remember that 1 Timothy 2, verse 5 tells us, "For there's one God and one mediator between God and men, the man Jesus Christ." Turn over to Revelation 21, verse 9. If you would, Revelation 21, verse 9. Now, angels are created beings. We talked about that. And we are to worship and pray to our Creator, but never to the created, right? Again, Revelation 21, verse 9. "And there came unto me one of the seven angels, which had the seven vials full of the seven last plagues, and talked with me, saying, Come here, I will show you the bride, the Lamb's wife. And he carried me away in the Spirit to a great and high mountain, and showed me that great city, the holy Jerusalem, descending out of heaven from God." Now, at this point, the angel showed John many things. You can read about them. Let's skip over what he showed him and turn over a page or so, if you would, to Revelation 22, verse 8. This is after the angel had shown John these things. So after John saw the things that the angel showed him, what did John do? Again, Revelation 22, verse 8. "And I, John, saw these things and heard them. And when I had heard and seen, I fell unto worship before the feet of the angel which showed me these things." Then what happened? "Then he said to me, See you, do it not." In other words, don't do it. Don't worship me. "For I am your fellow servant, and of my brethren, the prophets, and of them which keep the sayings of this book." Worship God. We're not to worship statues or dead humans or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that's in the water under the earth, or anything else for that matter, including angels. We're to worship only the one true God. So I think it answers that question. No, we're not to pray or worship the angels. They are created beings just as we are. Another question we had is, has any of us ever seen an angel? You might be able to answer that question yourself, but let's turn over to Hebrews 13, if you would. Hebrews chapter 13. We'll begin in verse 1. And okay, let's see. I might remind everybody as we go through this today that the word angel in the Bible can mean either what? An angel from heaven or a human messenger. Let's go ahead to Hebrews 13, verse 1. "Let brotherly love continue. Be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares." I suspect this is probably talking about heavenly angels. The words "to entertain strangers," those three words are the single Greek word G5381. In Strong's, it's philonexia, and it means simply hospitality or to be hospitable to others. You know, think of Lot, who took in those two men who came to Sodom. Now, these two angels actually planned to abide in the street all night, but Lot offered them the safety of his home rather than them spending the night in the street. I don't think it was probably safe. He fed them too. And we also talked about men who sometimes seem to show up and rescue someone in trouble, maybe in a supernatural way. Could that be an angel from heaven? We know that angels from heaven have appeared as men, particularly young men in the Bible. So are we sure we'd recognize an angel in human form if we saw one? I don't know. As we said earlier, there have been situations where men seem to appear out of nowhere and perform miraculous feats, such as displaying superhuman strength. So I believe it's possible that we may have had contact with an angel from heaven, but just didn't know it at the time. But have any of us ever seen an angel from heaven for sure? I don't think I can answer that question, but I think it's certainly possible. And if we do sometimes interact or entertain an angel, we don't want a bad report to go back to God, right? Well, speaking of angels reporting back to God, that got me to my next question. One question we had concerning angels reporting what they see to God is God relying on them? It sometimes seems as we read the Bible that God might be needing or relying on these reports. In the book of Enoch, fallen angels were corrupting humans here on the earth. Now, some of the good angels reported what the bad ones were doing. In that book, it looked as if God had absolutely no idea about this until his good angels came and told him. Now, that's not in the Bible. But there are places in the Bible that almost appear to suggest that God needs his angels to report what they see in order for him to know what's going on in our world, that he can't see everything. He needs them for that information. So I guess the question really is it possible that God cannot see everything and that he does rely on his angels to tell him what's happening on the earth? Otherwise, he might not know. In other words, is God truly omnipresent and omniscient? Or must he depend on others to keep him informed on what's going on, specifically the angels? So Psalms 139, verse 7. Psalms 139 and verse 7. So my question here is God omnipresent? Can he be everywhere and see everything himself without the need for his angels to always be his eyes and ears? Let's see if David can answer this question for us. Again, Psalm 139, verse 7. Here's what he says. Where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? David seems to be asking God, where can I go that you won't be there, where you won't see me? Verse 8. If I ascend up to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in hell, meaning the grave, behold, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there shall your hand lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. So David tells us that no matter where David might go, God will be there. God's presence is everywhere. We can't hide from God. Now, if God was depending on his angels to tell him everything, it would seem that he might be on the same level as the very beings he created. But God doesn't have blind spots. He indeed knows everything. 1 John chapter 3, verse 18. And if God needed the angels to tell him what was going on, if the angels missed something, then God wouldn't know everything. But indeed, God does know everything. Again, 1 John 3, verse 18. My little children, let us not love in word, neither in tongue, but in deed and in truth. And hereby we know that we are of the truth, and shall assure our hearts before him. For if our heart condemns us, God is greater than our own heart, and knows all things. So there it is. God knows all things. And think about this for a minute. We know that God knows the end from the beginning, right? Now, think about this. Angels were created right before the earth, basically, or sometime before then. But angels have not witnessed the millennium. They haven't been there yet. They haven't witnessed the last great day. Yet God's prophets have been given visions of them. So, how could God's created angels speak to God of things they have not yet witnessed? So they wouldn't know, but God does. But I'm sure that God wants the angels to be witnesses to human affairs and to the progress of his plan of salvation, just as they were witnesses to the creation of the earth and rejoiced. Why do we ask for things in prayer? God knows our needs. Why do we bother? In fact, Matthew 6, verse 8 tells us, your Father knows what things you have need of before you ask him. God doesn't require us to tell him what our needs are for him to know. He already knows. He knows all things. But he desires a relationship with us. He desires two-way communication. I suspect that the angels aren't actually reporting anything to God he doesn't already know. But like us, he wants to hear from them and acknowledge their important message. So anyway, I'd like to shift gears a bit. Actually, we're going to be shifting gears a lot. So hang with me here. And if you're about to nod off, you might want to wake up and watch this, because this is going to be pretty heavy. I think so anyway. Where do ideas like purgatory and limbo come from? They're not in our Bibles. So where did they originate and why? Well, man doesn't seem to like to admit he doesn't know something. He usually has to have an answer or an explanation for everything, whether he does or not. If he doesn't have the answer, he'll make one up. How many of us have seen a lunar eclipse? We recently had one that was visible to many of us. We were blocked out by clouds here. What causes a lunar eclipse? Who knows what causes a lunar eclipse? I think most of us know that when the sun, the moon, and the earth line up just right, the moon moves into the earth's shadow and disappears for a little while. As soon as its orbit brings it out of the shadow, it becomes visible again. Okay. Well, what if I told you that a lunar eclipse is not caused by the moon passing through the earth's shadow? That really, when the moon, or the sun for that matter, disappears, this is actually being caused by a giant dragon devouring it. Well, that's actually what many ancient cultures came to believe. With the Chinese, it was a dragon. With the Indians, it was a serpent. And it must be true, because when the people saw the moon or the sun being devoured, they would get together and make a great noise with anything they could. Now, when startled by this noise, the dragon or serpent or whatever would loose his hold on the moon or sun and take flight. And this worked every single time, proving, of course, that the moon or sun was being devoured by a large animal. It may have taken a few minutes, but eventually it worked, as I said, every time. All that noise scared away that sun or moon-eating animal. Now, we know that these stories, and many like them, are not true. They were made up by men who try to explain something they don't quite understand. But once we make a wrong assumption, then we often fabricate explanations to try to support our wrong assumptions. When the pagan doctrine of the immortal soul infiltrated the church, it created some problems. The belief was that man had an immortal soul that was always conscious and could perform without a body, could function without a body at any time. Now, people also believed that other than the earth, there was only the heaven and the eternally burning hell. When people died and left their physical bodies behind, heaven or hell were the only possible places where people's immortal souls could exist. But then they realized they had a problem. Until Jesus Christ came and made it possible for us to be forgiven of our sins, no one could go to heaven. No one could enter heaven. So the problem is, where did the good people go when they died before Christ came and redeemed us by his sacrifice for us? Those people in the Old Testament, for example. Well, they had only two possibilities of where the dead could exist, right? Heaven or hell. The dead weren't allowed in heaven, not before the first coming of Jesus Christ. Their sins had not yet been forgiven. But surely these good people could not go to this hell of fire and brimstone. There just must be some other place for the dead to hang out, at least until Christ comes and redeems us. There just had to be some other option. And so purgatory and limbo became additional locations where these immortal spirits could go, at least until such time where humans could be forgiven and actually enter heaven, right? Now, actually, I should probably mention that I believe that limbo is said to be located in hell, but in its outer part where the flames don't reach. But anyway, without any biblical support whatsoever, purgatory and limbo were created as alternatives to going to that hell of fire and brimstone. Now, many today are learning that there is no immortal soul. When we die, we go to our grave until our resurrection, and then we live again. And there's no need for a place such as purgatory or limbo to account for that. It simply isn't needed. The point I'm trying to make is that we need to be very careful about believing something that was invented to cover a faulty assumption. And if we make an incorrect assumption, we could inadvertently come up with false doctrine ourselves. I'm sure you're probably wondering what this has to do with angels about now. Well, we're about to get to that. So if you will turn to 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 4, we'll take a look. Today we're aware of the physical world, physical beings such as ourselves and the universe, things we can see. We're also aware of spirit beings in a location called heaven. That's because our Bibles speak of these. We believe our Bibles. But there are many people who believe there are places like purgatory and limbo that can't be seen, and neither can they be found in our Bibles. Many people today believe that there's a special place somewhere where angels from heaven are being restrained today. In fact, I would say probably most of us, when we read 2 Peter 2 verse 4, probably believe that. The difference here in what I'm talking about before is that this place is mentioned in some of our Bibles. And this place even has a name. It's called Tartarus. Now, we might want to put our seatbelts on because we're going to be going really fast here probably. I'll try to go slow. Trying to understand the scripture might result in a bumpy ride for some of us. Now, I'll be reading this word for word from the modern King James Version of the Bible. Be sure and follow along in your own Bibles, of course. Now, this again is the modern King James Bible, 2 Peter 2, verse 4. For if God did not spare sinning angels, but thrust them down into Tartarus, and being delivered into chains of darkness, being reserved unto judgment. Now, again, this is the modern King James Version. Yours might be different. So, apparently there's a special place for angels that have sinned. It has a name, Tartarus. How many of us are aware of this place where sinning angels are being held today? How many of us knew about this? Probably those that have the modern King James Bible. Well, it might appear that God thrust the heavenly angels that sinned down to a place called Tartarus, a place where they're being restrained, bound by chains of darkness, reserved to their judgment. That seems to be what the vast majority teach, if they teach this verse at all. Although they don't use the same name as Tartarus, like the modern King James does. So we spoke earlier of purgatory and limbo, but unlike these locations that are not found in our Bibles, we do see the word Tartarus in the modern King James. So we're reading that, then my question is, what is Tartarus? Where is it? And why is it not mentioned anywhere else in the Bible? Well, these things always puzzled me. I never really heard a satisfactory explanation for this verse. So you might want to double check your seatbelts as I try to explain this verse with my understanding. We'll see how that works. To help prepare us for God's kingdom, we can all practice being judges today. You get to decide whether my understanding is correct, partially correct, or if I'm just crazy. Whatever you decide, I think you will find this interesting, to say the least. Here we go. Okay, the word Tartarus, as found in the modern King James, is very easy to find in a reference material. You can look this up for yourself, so it won't take you long. Let me read to you what I found on one typical source. This is from the website GreekMythology.com. Here's what it said, quote, in Greek mythology, Tartarus was both a primordial deity that existed before the Olympians, as well as a name to describe a region of the underworld, close quote. We see here that Tartarus is the name of a false god, a mythical Greek god, just another false god. But the word Tartarus also refers to a place. So where is Tartarus? Let's continue in this article. Quote, as a place, it was far below than where Hades resided, and it was used as the most horrible prison. Some accounts say that the distance between Tartarus and Hades was the same as between the earth and the heaven. Although the kingdom of Hades was the place of the dead, Tartarus was where ferocious monsters and horrible criminals were banished, or where the gods imprisoned their rivals after a war. End quote. So Tartarus was a prison for the worst of the worst, which were the gods, plural, imprisoned their rivals after a war. Does anybody get the feeling something's not quite right here? Who are the angels that sinned? in this verse? Well, most will say that's Satan and his demons. That's the common response. So it might seem that Satan and his demons have all been cast into this prison. Well, this was said in the past tense. God did not spare the sinning angels, but thrust them down to Tartarus, to a prison to be held there in chains until the time of their judgment. And that would mean that Satan and all the demons are in this prison right at this very moment. They're being restrained and presumably unable to affect humans today. But if you ask me, it seems like Satan and his demons are working overtime today. So it's hard for me to believe that they're actually being restrained in some prison. And why would God thrust anyone into a prison bearing the name of a false god? To a place where the false gods allegedly sent their criminals or defeated enemies. Now, it's true that Satan will eventually be in a prison or a place of restraint, but that doesn't occur until the return of Jesus Christ in the beginning of the millennium. That's not happened yet. So, if you're confused as I am or was or whichever, let me try to offer you an explanation, an alternate explanation of 2 Peter 2, verse 4. One I believe, personally, is 100% consistent with the rest of the Bible. Again, I ask each of us to evaluate this for ourselves. Let me know what you think. Try to keep up, but it's going to be fun. Okay, and remember, as always, it's not about what you may have been taught. It's not about what I'm saying today. It's about what our Bible actually says, despite finding some apparent errors and mistranslations in our English Bibles. So if you're ready, let's take a look at this passage again. And you may have noticed the first time that I read this passage in the modern King James Version. Now I'm going back to the popular 1611 King James and read it again. 2 Peter 2, verse 4. For if God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell, and delivered them into chains of darkness, to be reserved unto judgment. You might notice that the King James kind of disagrees with the modern King James. The modern King James said they were cast down to the Tartarus of Greek mythology, but the King James used the word hell. So which is it? Actually, when we look at this passage in the Greek, the word used there is neither the Greek Tartarus and it's not Hades. In fact, it's Tartaru. But Tartaru is not a place. It's not a prison. In fact, Tartaru is not even a noun. It's actually a verb. It's an action. So if you want to take a look at Strong's dictionary, you'll find that Tartaru is Greek word 5020. I think Strong's even struggles a bit, but I think they have the correct definition. Tartaru is a verb. The action, its meaning is cast down to hell. Tartaru means cast down to hell. In fact, the entire phrase, cast them down to hell, comes from the single Greek word Tartaru, which is exactly how the 1611 King James Bible translated it. Although I will say the word them in the King James was added for clarity. If you have a King James Bible, the word them is like in italics, indicating it was an added word. Okay, so now we're getting somewhere. Here's another very important question. At the time the 1611 King James Bible was written, what was the meaning of the word hell? When they translated this word out and used the word hell, what did hell mean? If you're not sure, you might want to check out our website. Go there, if you would, click on the Bible Fundamentals series and watch the video, What is Hell? We'll find in the 17th century, when the King James was being translated, the word hell in the Old English simply meant a place in the ground, a grave or a pit. That's it. The vast majority of the time we see the word hell in our Bibles, it simply means the grave. There are places in the New Testament where hell refers to Gehenna fire, but 2 Peter 2, verse 4 is the only place in the King James that the word hell appears where it is not a grave, a pit, or Gehenna. Here, hell is not translated from Sheol, Hades, or Gehenna, but all the other occurrences of the King James translate. Well, okay, say it again. Okay. Hell is not translated from Sheol, Hades, or Gehenna, as are all other occurrences of hell found in the King James. This is the only place we see this. And again, it's translated from the Greek Tartaru, meaning cast down to hell, or in our modern English, it means cast down to the grave. Okay, Since I bungled that up, let's give you a test. Okay. If someone in the 17th century, speaking Old English, if they were describing someone who had just died and been buried, what might they say about that person? They might say, our deceased person is in hell. Because to them, they were simply meaning the grave. But check that out. Now, what happened? Well, the church changed the name. Well, actually, the church changed the meaning of the word hell from that of a grave or a pit to that of a place of fire and brimstone where sinners burn for eternity. And I believe they did that simply to support their errant doctrine. But how might we describe a person in the grave? If you're thinking about that, a person in the grave, how would you describe that? Well, 2 Peter 2 verse 4 says that these people in their graves are delivered into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment. Would you say that those who are in their graves are in chains of darkness? In other words, they're not going anywhere. They're certainly held a prisoner in their grave, surrounded by darkness. They're not going anywhere. And what are they doing in their graves? We might say they're awaiting the time when they'll be resurrected to be judged. I believe that 2 Peter 2 verse 4 states that the angels that sinned were cast down to their graves, the prison of darkness that holds them until the time of their judgment. We see no evidence of bright flames and heat, as you might expect if this was truly a place of fire and brimstone. Instead, we see the darkness of the grave. Am I using this verse to prove that sinning angels from heaven can go to their grave and therefore can die? Actually, I'm not. We'll be talking about that later. We decide if angels can die or not. That's probably going to be next week. But I think we have a problem with this verse. If the angels that sinned, angels from heaven that sinned, are in their graves now, that wouldn't make any sense either. So at that point, they wouldn't be bothering mankind today, but we know they are. So something's still wrong. We're not quite done with this verse yet. When we started this series on angels, I gave us a definition of angel from our Bibles. We said then that the word angel, malak in the Old Testament Hebrew, and the Greek angelos in the New Testament simply means a messenger. That's right. We said that when we see the word angel in our Bibles, that outside of the rare occurrence where a spirit being or a human is specified, the only way to determine which it is would be by the context. Now, reading this verse alone here, as we just did, does not indicate whether an angel from heaven, a spirit being, or a human messenger is being spoken of. There's no way to tell. You know, in fact, it's odd because I don't ever recall hearing anyone quote this voice. Excuse me. Try this again. Excuse me a second. Still over my issues here with my sinuses. Okay. What I was going to say is, I don't recall ever hearing anybody quote this verse in context. I've always heard it quoted alone to prove something else. Let's see if we can determine whether these are angels from heaven or human messengers by using the verses surrounding this verse for context. Will it give us a clue? And again, let's take a look, but you be the judge. If we might be judging in the kingdom, we might as well get some practice in now, right? So let's try that. Back to 2 Peter 1, verse 16, the previous chapter. 2 Peter 1:16, we're going to back up a little bit and see what was going on when this verse was being talked about. We don't want to assume anything. So let's go back and look. Here Peter is telling us that Jesus' disciples received the gospel they preached straight from Jesus Christ. So 2 Peter 1, verse 16. And I would say that they remind us that they preached the gospel Jesus preached. They didn't teach about Easter bunnies or other such fables. That's important to remember. So let's go again. 2 Peter 1, verse 16. For we have not followed cunningly devised fables, when we were made known unto you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but were eyewitnesses of his majesty. For he received from God the Father honor and glory, when there came such a voice to him from the excellent glory, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Verse 19. We have also a more sure word of prophecy, whereunto you do well that you take heed, as unto a light that shines in a dark place, until the day dawn and the day star arise in your hearts. So Peter is telling us that they have a more reliable gospel than those who teach fairy tales or fables. Verse 20. Knowing this first, that no prophecy of the Scriptures of any private interpretation. For the prophecy came not in old time by the will of man, but holy men of God spake as they were moved by the Holy Spirit. So what are they talking about here? What's the point of this subject? Well, they're telling us to be sure to follow the original teaching of Jesus Christ, as told reliably by those that were with him. We should do well to stay with them and reject teachers that teach as fables. Okay. All right. So why are they saying this in this part of the Bible? What problem are they addressing? Why are they telling us to stay away from those teaching fables instead of truth? I think the answer can be found in our very next verse. Let's look at that. 2 Peter 2, verse 1. Here's what the problem was, and here's what they were trying to address. But there were false prophets also among the people, even as there shall be false prophets among you. Are there any false prophets today? Any false teachers teaching? They're all over the place. Let's go ahead. Your privilege shall bring in damnable heresies, even denying the Lord that bought them, and bring upon themselves swift destruction. And many shall follow their pernicious ways, by reason of whom the way of truth shall be evil spoken of. Now, these false teachers will even speak evil of those preaching the truth of God. We see that today. Haven't you experienced that probably? They call us names, think we're crazy. Verse 3. And through covetousness shall they with feigned words make merchandise of you. The word covetousness, if I can pronounce it correctly, is in the Greek phleonexia. It means avarice, fraud, or extortion. Now, these teachers or pastors are frauds. Are they committing fraud and extortion in their congregations? Think about the implied message of many traditional churches throughout time. Just accept Jesus as your Savior. Keep attending our church, meaning give us your money, because we're the only true church. And if you don't, you might spend eternity in that hell of fire and brimstone, one we know doesn't actually exist. But saying that does motivate some people to join their church. But using that as a threat, these false teachers make money off their congregation by using artificial or fake words to manipulate them. So, what happens to these false teachers? Continuing in verse 3. Whose judgment now of a long time lingers not, and their damnation slumbers not. Damnation here meaning destruction. Stop for a second here. What is the subject of the first 3 verses of 2 Peter chapter 2? Is it about angels from heaven? Or angels from heaven that sinned? Or is it about men? Messengers of God that have strayed from the truth, teaching fables to make merchandise out of their people. Messengers of God who sin by lying to their followers to make money for themselves. What do we call people today that claim to be messengers from God? We typically don't call them angels today. What do we call them? Teachers? We could probably call some of them that, but that's not very specific. What about ministers? What about the word pastors? A pastor is someone who claims to have a message from God, isn't that right? A pastor is someone that says he's bringing you the word from God. Well, since we haven't seen anything here about angels from heaven, which is kind of odd, let's review our definition of the word angel found in 2 Peter and the rest of the New Testament. Now, again, that word was G32 in Strong's. If you want to look it up, it's the word angelos. The meaning, as we said before, a messenger. Let me give you the whole definition. A messenger, especially an angel. Now, angel here is in quotes. I'll be that indicates they're talking about an angel from heaven. Let me read the whole definition. Again, a messenger, especially an angel, but by implication, a pastor. That's straight out of Strong's. So according to Strong's dictionary, the word angelos, translated as angel, can mean an actual angel from heaven or a human messenger, specifically a pastor? So here's a question. I think the answer is obvious, but does the Greek angelos, translated as angel here in the King James, mean an angel from heaven or a pastor? Who's the topic of the first 3 verses of 2 Peter chapter 2? Well, it was false human messengers, false pastors, pastors that sinned. I think the context is crystal clear. I don't believe verse 4 refers to an angel from heaven, but rather to a human messenger, as Strong suggests, a pastor. So let's see now. What does God have to say about these pastors who have sinned by telling lies and fables to their followers to get their money? Verse 4 again. For if God spared not the angels or the pastors that sinned, what happened to these pastors? But cast them down to hell, the grave, and delivered them into the chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment. I don't think we need the mysterious place of Tartarus, prison of the Greek gods, to explain this message. I don't think we need to believe that Satan and his demons are in a place of restraint today. They aren't. I think this is obvious. But we can believe that all those pastors in Peter's day that sinned by preaching a perverted gospel to take people's money, they all went to their graves. They were not spared. And they're not going anywhere. They're being held by chains, the walls of the grave. And they'll be there until their resurrection and their judgment. They're being held there until their judgment, just as we read in 2 Peter 2, verse 4. Now, we looked at this verse, we looked at the context before this verse. What about the context afterward? Let's look at the verses after 2 Peter 2, verse 4 to see if the context has changed or what happens with that. I'm trying to establish beyond the shadow of a doubt that the angels being spoken of here are not angels from heaven, but men. Let's see how it goes on out. Verse 5. And spared not the old world, but saved Noah, the 8th person, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly. Here again, we're talking about the fate of ungodly men. These unrighteous men, well, they're in their watery graves, and they too await their resurrection and their judgment. Verse 6. And turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, keep that in mind, into ashes, condemn them with an overthrow, making them an example to those that after should live ungodly. So we're warned what's going to happen to us if we live ungodly. Verse 7. And delivered just Lot, vexed with the filthy conversation of the wicked. But if you notice here, the topic remains consistent. It's about men who sinned and were cast into their graves and await their judgment. Verse 9. The Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of temptations and to reserve the unjust unto the day of judgment, to be punished. Just as verse 4 said, these human pastors that sin will be reserved until the day of judgment. And that's the theme of 2 Peter chapter 2. Verse 10. But chiefly them that walk after the flesh and the lust of uncleanness, and despise government. Presumptuous are they. Self-willed, they are not afraid to speak evil of dignities. Now, the next verse, verse 11, is the only other time where angels are mentioned in this book of the Bible. Is this speaking of angels from heaven or of humans? Let's see. Verse 11. Whereas angels, there's the word, which are greater in power and might, bring not railing accusation against them before the Lord. Okay. Up until now, we've been talking exclusively about humans so far in this chapter. Humans that sin. The them in verse 11 refers to humans. But notice that the angels spoken of here are greater in power and might than these sinful humans. Our topic throughout the entire chapter of this chapter of the Bible. Now, these are obviously the powerful angels from heaven. But we see that the angels from heaven do not bring accusations against them. That's not the job of the angels, but remember that for a couple minutes. But I wanted to point out that if angels from heaven had been the topic here, verse 11 will make no sense. If the them in verse 11 meant angels from heaven, then the use of angels in this verse could not denote beings greater in power and might, since they would be the same beings. So is your head spinning yet? Probably. I know mine does that from time to time, especially when I'm trying to explain this. But I think we're making a case here. Let's read the next 4 verses, and this is going to be important, so hang on to this. Verse 12. But these as natural brute, remember the word brute beasts, made to be taken and destroyed, speak evil of the things that they understand not. Sound familiar? And shall not utterly perish in their own corruption, and shall utterly perish in their own corruption, and shall receive the reward of the unrighteousness, as they that count it pleasure to riot in the daytime. Spots they are and blemishes, sporting themselves with their own deceivings, while they feast with you. And unfortunately, see if verse 14 doesn't describe way too many pastors today. Men that we would think would be good examples of how to be a Christian, right? Verse 4. But having eyes full of adultery, and they cannot cease from sin, beguiling unstable souls, a heart they have exercised with covetous practices, cursed children. Well, if you keep up with Christian news, I think we'll find that pastors practically weekly are admitting to things like adultery, sexual crimes, crimes against children, embezzlement, most of the time after they're caught. But anyway, it's very sad, but that's happening today. Verse 15. Which are forsaken the right way, in other words, the true gospel, and are gone astray, following the way of Balaam. Remember Balaam, the son of Bosor, who loved the wages of unrighteousness. So again, 2 Peter 2 verse 4 is not about angels from heaven that are kept in the mythological Tartarus. It's about the pastors who sinned, who were not spared death, but were sent to their graves to await their judgment. Now, we just have to take a look at this while we're here today, and that's Jude. You would turn over to Jude. I think you'll find this interesting. There's only one chapter in Jude, so that's easy. Jude chapter 1, verse 6, right? Okay. Now, I'm not sure who influenced whom, but Jude and Peter say exactly the same thing. I'm going to assume that Jude was speaking after what Peter said, but let's do a quick recap of what he just saw in 2 Peter. You might want to jot this down. We're going to do a comparison. I think you'll be surprised. So here's 6 points I'm going to give you we just read. From 2 Peter chapter 2, the first thing is, pastors left the true gospel and began to preach a false one. They were false teachers, false prophets. Number 2, God spared not these angels or pastors that sinned. They're in their graves, reserved in chains of darkness until judgment day. Number 3, Sodom and Gomorrah are additional examples of what happened to ungodly men. Right? We saw that. Number 4, the heavenly angels did not bring accusations against these sinning men. We saw that. Number 5, these sinners are called brutes. And number 6, they followed the way of Balaam. Remember just reading that? Let's see how closely Jude parallels 2 Peter chapter 2. Again, let's go to Jude verse 6. Item number 1 we had is the pastors left the true gospel and began to preach a false one. They were false prophets. Jude verse 6. And the angels, again meaning human pastors just like before, which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation. And these pastors left the truth to preach fables and tickle the ears of followers to make merchandise out of them. Item number 2. God spared not these angels that sinned. They're reserved in chains of darkness until judgment day. Back to Jude verse 6. He is reserved in everlasting chains under darkness until the judgment of the great day. So again, these false teachers are in chains of darkness, awaiting their judgment in the last great day. Okay, item number 3. Sodom and Gomorrah were additional examples of what happened to ungodly men back in 2 Peter. So Jude verse 7. Even as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities about them in like manner, giving themselves over to fornication and going after strange flesh, are set forth for an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. This is basically a repeat of 2 Peter chapter 2, wouldn't you say? Verse 8. Item number 4, by the way. The heavenly angels did not bring accusations against these men. That's not their job, right? Verse 8. Likewise, also these filthy dreamers defile the flesh, despise dominion, and speak evil of dignities. Yet Michael, the archangel, when contending with the devil, he disputed about the body of Moses, did not bring against him a railing accusation, but said, "The Lord rebuke you." Notice again that Michael the archangel, an angel from heaven, is not an accuser. We just saw that again in 2 Peter. Item number 5. We saw those sinners called brutes. Verse 10. But these speak evil of those things which they know not, but what they know naturally as brute beasts. In those things they corrupt themselves. Item number 6. This is our last item to compare. But remember, we were told they followed the way of Balaam. Verse 11. Woe to them, for they have gone in the way of Cain, and ran greedily after the error of Balaam for reward, and perished in the gainsaying of Kor. 2 Peter chapter 2 and Jude contain parallel scripture with the same meaning. 2 Peter 2 verse 4 and Jude verse 6 can be very difficult to understand. A lot of ideas out there, but I believe what we just seen today is consistent with what our Bibles teach. Satan and his demons, those angels that sinned, they're not in a place of restraint today. They're all around us. You can see their work. We know they will be in a place of restraint when Christ returns and begins his millennial reign, but that's another time, and that's another story. Regardless of how you view these passages, I ask everyone to be very careful to never assume that the word angel in our Bibles always refers to a spirit from heaven, spirit being from heaven. Always look at the context. Are there clues to be sure we have the correct being? Wow, was that intense? It was for me. I struggled to get it out. Well, to be honest, I'd planned to answer the question, can angels from heaven ever die or be killed? I was going to do that today. There's a lot more to this question than appears on the surface. So we're not going to get there today. We've had enough, I think, for one day. We'll dig deeper in this next week, God willing. So until then, may God bless us all. He continue to reveal his plan of salvation to us. Good Sabbath, everyone.